The Canada Caribbean Research Symposium was the inaugural event of the Canada Caribbean Institute, which was formed as part of the partnership between the University of the West Indies and Brock University. The Canada Caribbean Institute aims to provide a focal point for multidisciplinary research and teaching to deepen and improve the multifaceted relationships between Canada and the Caribbean and examine issues affecting Caribbean diaspora communities in Canada. The symposium presented current research and projects being conducted on issues pertinent to Canada and the Caribbean. Panel 4 focused on Caribbean culture and the diaspora.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm going to jump in and move on to this wonderful next panel. I just want to say that what a delight to be here. So I will say, my esteemed colleagues, I am so honored, delighted that you're here today, and they will speak to the kinds of work that they're doing, but I will just say briefly that I'm so delighted to be in the company of my colleagues today, and we look forward to you sharing the wealth of knowledge that you brought to us today. So we'll begin with Dr. Michael and his presentation. That is, I will give you the signal at 15 minutes, and we're expecting a 20-minute presentation. Thank you.
The paper is entitled Canadian Roots, Transnational Sites of Caribbean Literary Development. In 2003, a declaration by David Shariandi, Trinidadian Canadian writer and critic, at a McMaster University conference, stopped me in my literary historical tracks. He indicated that Canada was a main, if not the main, publishing site for Caribbean literature. Intuitively, I thought he might in fact be right, given my own survey in the 1990s, and I was curious as to what evidence he had to support this claim. Between the 1950s, when London becomes a crucible for Caribbean literary development, and the post-1990s, when Leeds in the UK, home of People Tree Press, mushrooms into the main publishing outlet for Caribbean writing, Canada featured as another transnational hub of Caribbean literary production. Certainly, the 1980s to the 1990s, there was a real expansion of Canadian publishing of Caribbean writers that adds an important supplement to Caribbean literary historiography if we turn our attention to Toronto and Montreal in particular and Canada in general. Shariandi's bold declaration in 2003 follows the 1987 intimation by Cyril Dabedine, Guyanese Canadian, in his anthologizing work, and my own 1998 elaboration in my PhD thesis that a sizable number of writers who had Caribbean descent were either living or publishing in Canada, so much so that a new subdivision of literary production could be recognized as Caribbean Canadian writing. Like the UK, where Caribbean peoples migrated to fill labor shortages in the post-World War period, 1940s, referred to as the Windrush era, Canada in 1955 developed an agreement with the Caribbean governments for supplying domestic workers. We have spoken about this earlier today, and later farm workers to supplement their labor markets. As David Austin argues, quote, in the 1960s, Blacks of diverse origins entered Canada as England attempted to curb the immigration of Caribbean men and women whose presence was evoking a fear that they were disrupting Britain's national identity, unquote. At the same time, according to Sean Mills, quote, while Britain began restricting non-white immigrants in the early 1960s, Canada began to undo some of the more overtly discriminatory aspects of its own immigration policy. And as a result of the changes, the makeup of immigrants to Canada began to change, unquote. Even so, both these metropolitan centers, UK and Canada, were always sites of educational pursuit for Caribbean peoples. Beyond migration patterns, artistic friendships, and the sharing of the mechanisms for artistic promotion, radio, and later television exposure of Caribbean literature shifted to the CBC in Toronto, Canada, just as the BBC migrates its post-colonial literary magazine program, Caribbean Voices, in 1958 to Ghana, reborn as the Singing Net. I've already argued in an article Beyond Windrush, Austin Clarke, Race and Canadian Influence on the Anglophone Caribbean Literature, that Barbadian-Canadian writer Austin Clarke had been capitalizing on radio in Canada, similar to the way in which Salke and others were making use of the BBC in the first renaissance of Caribbean writing. However, Clarke's connection to the editors of the all-important little magazine, the Tamarack Review, which had huge cultural capital and preening prestige, raises a question of how publishing outlets also provide a trace of Canadian development of Caribbean literature. One of the most comprehensive surveys of Black writing in Canada that provides insights into Caribbean Canadian publication history is George Eliot Clarke's 2002 A Primer of African Canadian Literature, dedicated to the memory of Trinidadian Canadian writer and critic and bibliographer Loris Elliott. For example, in this account, Eliot Clarke identifies Antiguan Canadian Peter E. Macaro's History of the Colored Baptists of Nova Scotia, published in 1895, as probably the first text published by a Caribbean-born writer in Canada. However, it is really in the 1960s that a firm foundation for the reception of Caribbean Canadian writing is laid with the media, literary, and activist work of Austin Clarke, by far the most successful Anglophone Caribbean Canadian writer at the time. Clarke also notes that in 1958, the Haitian Canadian playwright Frank Fouché apparently self-publishes a version of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex in his native language in Montreal, which is the earliest published play by a Caribbean-born writer in Canada. This revelation announces Montreal as another possible productive site for Francophone Caribbean literature, if not Anglophone Caribbean literary development, as well as indicates the importance of looking at self-published works. The other notable firsts for Eliot Clarke in respect to Caribbean Canadian publication are Alma Norman, already referenced in this symposium, whom he characterizes as a Black Atlanticist since she was born in the US in 1930, studied in Montreal, and published in 1964 her sole book of poems, Ballads of Jamaica in Jamaica. And the Trinidadian Canadian Lennox Brown, who publishes the first Anglophone Caribbean Canadian play, The Captive, in 1965. The inclusion of someone like Alma Norman suggests a great flexibility in Eliot Clarke's conception of African Canadian, and by extension, Caribbean Canadian literature. Residence in Canada, even for a period of attending university. Norman has both an MA and a teaching diploma from a Canadian university. Birth in Canada and life afterwards in the Caribbean, or publication in Canada by a writer of Caribbean birth, qualifies one to be included. However, this kind of flexibility can become tricky for identifying his list of firsts. A contemporary of Austin Clarke, C. Everett Palmer, for example, migrates to Canada from Jamaica in the 1950s, publishes his first novel, A Broken Vessel, with Pioneer Press in Jamaica in 1960, and subsequently publishes all his other novels in Jamaica or via an international press as Andre Deutsch, which releases in London, England, and New York, USA. By residence, Palmer would be considered a Caribbean Canadian writer and would have published ahead of Austin Clarke, though not by a Canadian publisher. But what of those born in Canada but grew up or settled in the Caribbean? Writers such as Hugh Dustin Carberry, born, we know as H.D. Carberry, born in Montreal in 1921, of Caribbean parentage, who publishes his first book, A West Indian in London, in 1950. Or John Hearn, of Jamaican parentage of Irish descent, who was also born in Montreal in 1925, and publishes his novels in London and Jamaica. In addition to residence in Canada and the Caribbean, both Hearn and Carberry also studied in the UK. I would also add to this group the more recently discovered Jamaican Creole Cyrus Perkins, who wrote Busher's Mistress or Catherine the Fugitive, a stirring romance of the days of slavery in Canada. Stirring romance and slavery in the same sentence is a little problematic. in 1854 to 55 and published it serially in the Daily Telegraph and the Jamaican Guardian in 1911. Or for that matter, writers born in the Caribbean who lived elsewhere for a while and then spent their final days residing in Canada, though not necessarily publishing much in Canada. Samuel Selvon and Louise Bennett Coverley come to mind. This digression into the complexity of the categorization of the Caribbean Canadian writer is to show that considerations of birth, residence, or publication in Canada nuance the narrative of Caribbean literary development, exposes the transnational, if not always, Black Atlantic framings of our literary history, and fills out the 1960s story beyond Austin Clarke's phenomenal success, who gains access to the Canadian publishing world. Access to and acceptance by the publishing establishment determined the ability of Caribbean Canadian writers to come into print and to achieve success as a writer. As Elliot Clarke argues, given the reluctance of mainstream Canadian publishers to handle Black writers until recently, small and alternative presses have produced much of the literature. For him, quote, contemporary African Canadian literature was ushered into being beginning in the 1960s by a constellation of presses around Toronto and Montreal, with major presses publishing the few and the small presses publishing the mass. Apart from those Francophone writers such as Haitian Canadian Fouché, whose first Canadian play was apparently self-published in 1958, and Etienne's, whose work is published by a small press in Montreal, Édition L'Esterel, in 1966. And apart from Anglophone writers such as Trinidadian Canadian Lennox Brown, whose plays are published by the small Ottawa Little Theatre in 1965 and 66, or the Jamaican Canadians Alma Norman and Sierbrad Palmer, who published in Jamaica, Austin Clarke stands virtually alone as published by a major Canadian press in the 1960s. It is not surprising, therefore, that as Elliot Clarke suggests, it was in the mid-1970s that a mini explosion in publication occurred. He identifies a number of presses that emerged, and Wallace's Wakakro published the first anthology of Black Canadian women's writing in 1975, while Harold Head's Khoisan artist produced Dion Brand's first chapbook in 1978. Head's anthology, Canada in Us Now, 1976, and Trinidadian Canadian Charles Roach's Soul Poetry Text, 1977, were carried by New Canadian Press. While race activism, media exposure, and Clarke's initial success opened up doors to publishing opportunities, other factors influenced the development of Caribbean literature in Canada. I've argued before that, quote, much of the visibility of Caribbean Canadian writers have been facilitated by the multicultural policy promulgated by what has been referred to as the Multiculturalism Act of 1988, first declared as state policy in 1971, and recognized in Section 27 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1981. Prior to the entrenchment of the 1988 Act, there had been publication support being acknowledged in anthologies and books by Caribbean Canadian writers. For example, the very valuable The Bibliography of Literary Writings by Blacks in Canada, 1986, edited by Trinidadian Canadian writer and critic Loris Elliott, who was an English professor at McGill University, provides this note in its prefatory pages, quote, published with the generous assistance of the multicultural sector, Secretary of State, the Canada Council, and the Ontario Arts Council, unquote. As Miriam Verena Richter argues, Trudeau envisioned that government support would help cultural groups, quote, to grow and contribute to Canada, unquote. The purpose of some publishing houses seems to have specifically embraced this multi-ethnic promotion in their work. Three path-breaking publishing establishments that provide a palimpsest of Caribbean literary production are Mosaic, New Canadian Press, and Williams Wallace. There's not enough time to detail those contributions, and so I'll just go on to conclude. As Hudson and Kamugisha note, through the 70s to the early 90s, the Black radical tradition was sustained and developed on Canadian soil by a remarkable cohort of Toronto-based activists, include intellectuals, journalists, poets, and writers, including Lillian Allen, Dion Brand, Afua Cooper, Makeda Silveira, Mandela, Althea Prince, Clifton Joseph, Norman Richmond, and M. Norbesi Philip. Yet prior to this was the transnational base in Montreal of student organizing, writers and activists whose vocal voices crescendoed at the 1968 Black Writers Congress post the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965 and Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968. As Austin argues, quote, for that long Canadian Thanksgiving weekend in October 1968, the Congress of Black Writers temporarily transformed Canada and Montreal into the center of the Black Power movement, unquote. Further, their activities involved the participation of several prominent Caribbean writers, artists, economists, and political figures, including Jan Carew, Norman Gervin, Austin Clarke, Lloyd Best, Richard B. Moore, and calypso singer The Mighty Sparrow. Given that in 1966, New Beacon Books had been established by John LaRose, who with Kamau Brathwaite, the late Kamau Brathwaite, and Andrew Salzke, also formed the Caribbean Artist Movement. Transnational coalitions of writing, publishing, and activism had already been activated. With the student activists in Montreal from all over the African diaspora, French and English, artists and thinkers, the Congress was a culmination of creative and political work going hand in hand. George Lamin and CLR James were two other non-Canadian-based writers who found ground in Montreal to share their work. There, James found these young West Indians devouring some of his most obscure works. As Buell pointed out, these ardent young intellectuals and activists met formally and informally, naturally, more often at close range as friends, to discuss and argue over texts, to become intimates that only fellow exile revolutionaries are likely ever to be. They hosted James and raised money for a book tour, and he remained fixed in Canada as an organizing base until permitted re-entry into the United States as a college lecturer in 1970. May I be permitted to read my conclusion? Thank you. When one reads accounts of CLR James's literary and political activities, one hardly hears of his Canadian sojourns or sustenance in much the same way that Canada, until recently, hardly features in Caribbean literary history. Yet, especially in the 1960s, both Toronto, through media promotion, and Montreal, through student activism, and both through publishing in the 1970s and beyond, created a solid ground for the development of writers. With the multicultural policy and government support for the arts, many migrants and students from the Caribbean found space to write and publish. Yet even for those who did not settle there, Canada was an enabling space of promotion of their work through radio and little magazine publications, aided and abetted initially by Austin Clarke at the CBC, but further sustained by the cultural work of so many others in publishing, reviewing, literary criticism. The transnational nature of Black organizing around the arts, what Gilroy calls Black Atlantic networking, plus the mobility of Black peoples living and moving throughout the world, and the fact that when shut out from official publishing, Caribbean writers will find small presses, little magazines, and their private publishing mechanisms to let their creative voices be heard, means that there's more to this story than has been recorded here. The account of Caribbean development in Canada is one that recognizes the importance of coalitions and collaborations with white institutional actors in the dominant media, with circles of African diasporic friendships across the world, and with those who share passionate politics around justice in activist work of the civil rights movement, for example, and sometimes with banding together to create publishing spaces for the group's creative endeavors. Thank you.
Dr. Michael, thank you so much. That was such a moving talk. I have to say, on a personal level, you explained a lot of the politics of writing. That was a question for me that I have too. So thank you. That was so moving. Really appreciate it. So next we have my two colleagues from Brock University who are going to introduce their full names and pronounce them properly for everybody. Thank you so much, Jean and Richard.
Good afternoon, friends. My name is Richard Gamia, and here is my twin brother, Jean Takiro. We have known each other for more than 30 years. Sometimes I think he knows better my life at the university than I remember. But we have also been working together on important projects at Brock University, basically to raise the profile of African, Canadian, as well as Black history. And we have a colleague we work with, and with him we like to refer to ourselves as the three Black Musketeers. So he proofread the presentation we have today, so we hope to get you interested in basically what we're looking at is from a Pan-Africanist point of view, what does Blackness mean, and we're looking also at the connection to the land by people of African descent in connection with First Nations from the Great North down to the Americas, going through the Caribbean, and also we touch on different cultures. And towards the end, we'll talk about a little bit of common ground that we want to work on. So our title, the title of our presentation is Grounding Our Roots and Routes, Exploring Our Shared Heritage and Common Connections to Mother Earth. The history of humanity is riddled with conflicts in which dominant groups try to erase the culture of the subjugated and remove them from their lands. However, victims of coerced exodus and historical obliteration maintain a strong connection to the historical memories of their ancestors' homeland, which can be an instrument of resistance against oppression. Our presentation explores what unites people of African descent worldwide beyond any race-based globalization. Considering the transatlantic slave trade which transplanted tens of millions of Africans to the Americas, we question what it is that still unites us in a rather profound way after centuries of spatiotemporal separation. Grounding our discussion in Seward's whole conceptualization of roots and routes and in Benedict Anderson's work on imagined community, we argue that one major link relates to the concept of grounding, our spatial multidimensional attachment to Mother Earth through Africanisms in the New World. We're talking about orature, drumming, rhythm, music, and dance. We also draw on Walter Rodney's conception of grounding as being rooted in place and in communion with the people. This paper is also a cultural comparatist in nature. It explores the concept of grounding truth in Jamaican culture, how truth has to be grounded in the earth to achieve authenticity, in parallel with the African Great Lakes traditional practice of ukubitinhahe. You will have to ask Jean a little bit more about that because he's the linguist. The examination of this ritual is further complemented by an overview of the cult of the Nyabingi spirit and its linkage to the Nyabingi Rastafari chants during their groundation. And as we know, humans have throughout millennia defended the lands which provide them sustenance as well as a sense of belonging. When these primordial elements are jeopardized, the attachment to land and the longing for return become even more pressing. In the Americas, First Nations people from the Inuits in the Arctic, the Aztecs and the Mayans in Central America to the Patagonians in the South have maintained strong ties to their lands, notwithstanding hundreds of years of genocide, cultural erasure, and confinement into reserves. And contrary to European attachment to property ownership, the land in most Canadian indigenous philosophy is sacred and has no owner. People do not own the land owns them. Therefore, every generation is the caretaker of Mother Earth for the next ones. And indeed, the tireless struggle by First Nations to reclaim their lands highlights the violation of the two-Rome Wampum Agreement by the Canadian government since 1613. And the most current litigation involves the Wet'suwet'en community's resistance against the construction of a pipeline in northern British Columbia, and it's all over the place now. In a similar fashion, Black loyalists agreed to fight for the British Crown because they were promised freedom and lands. Unfortunately, like the African Americans who are still waiting for their 40 acres and a mule, they did not get what they were promised. Those who got anything were offered poor quality lands without any deeds. Still today, many Black natives of Nova Scotia are battling to obtain land titles for the plots they have occupied for generations. We'll mention the reverse triangular route of the Jamaican Maroons in a moment. But to keep on going, the fight to preserve Africville in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with Michael alluded to a little bit, illustrates African people's attachment to the land. Originally, it was a it emerged as a Black community push to inhabit shanties devoid of any servicing. But with ingenuity, the residents of Africville created a vibrant community. Unfortunately, the city of Halifax bulldozed Africville in the 60s. Further to our discussion, diasporic Africans honor the land they live on and adapt to local toponymic practices. In the Caribbean, they named localities according to native topological customs. For instance, the Africans maintained the term Caribbean to recognize the region of the Caribs, Kalinagos. And after the Haitian revolutions, the emancipated Africans reclaimed the real Taino name of Haiti as opposed to Hispaniola and San Domingo. The people of this land continue to refer to its Taino designation, and hoping I'm saying it correctly, Hamaka, the land of wood and water, or land of the springs. Survival on a new continent entails going back to one's roots as an antithesis to cultural amnesia. And as a diasporic community, usually people of African descent remain strongly attached to their motherland. As Stuart Hall suggests, they will do their best to ground their roots wherever their routes will bring them. And for instance, Richard Pierpont, who fought alongside General Brock in Upper Canada against the Americans in the War of 1812, petitioned the British government repeatedly to send him back to his native Bondou in Senegal. Likewise, several Black loyalist Black refugees from the US and some Jamaican Maroons deported in 1796 from Tree Lonely Town to Nova Scotia volunteered to go to Liberia and Sierra Leone. Additionally, thousands of Africans, as you know, rebelled to return to their homelands, such as Sengepi and his companions on the Amistad. And in Jamaica, we are all aware of the Black Star liner, which was a concretization of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa campaign. An important note, women also played a vital role in the promotion of Pan-Africanist ideals. For instance, Anna Julia Cooper took France to task about its hypocritical attitude towards slavery during the Revolution. Both of Marcus Garvey's spouses worked intensely on Pan-African pursuits. Amy Ashwood Garvey as co-founder of UNIA and its newspaper, The Negro World, Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey, who actually wrote most of Garvey's speeches and published them in a book. The Back to Africa and Pan-Africanist movements also include notable figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who chose to finish his days in Ghana, Dr. Walter Rodney, who taught here at UWI and the University of Dar es Salaam, grounded his Afrocentric research and engagement both in academia and in the political arena, amplifying the voice of the Rastafari. And as we know, grounding in Rastafari is an integral pillar of their spirituality. Olive Senior's work on being grounded, or ground truth, is a topical mention. In certain Jamaican communities, based on specific spatial arrangements within the dwellings, the ground references a source of staple food and extra financial income. The statement, "I'm going to the ground, not to the field," exalts the sacred ground on which barefoot worshippers enter into contact with the spirits of the ancestors. And this conception of ground truth is comparable to the African Great Lakes traditional practice of Gukubitinhahe, by which traditional notables hit the ground with a talking stick called Inhahe, seeking the seal of approval from the ancestors under the ground during their legal deliberations. And we also know about the cult of Queen Nyabingi, which was developed during the rebellion against the British invasion of Central Eastern Africa. Upon her death, Nyabingi spirits migrated to Umugumya, the sacred tree that hosts the spirit of Kiranga. And just to also continue talking about Nyabingi because it's important, it's an important link to Rastafari. Her name was integrated into the Nyabingi Rastafari chants during their groundation ceremonies. And linked with that, we know that rhythm and cadence accompany the drum beat. Hence the importance of drumming in Afro-Caribbean societies. In his 1966 album, Soul Call, Duke Ellington jokingly announces that his master drummer, Sam Woodyard, wants the public to know that drum is a woman. Whatever he meant to say, we retain that woman through her carrying for life, generating life, and caring for life is the foundation of creation, giving meaning to the rhythm of the earth and the universe. The drum then encompasses motherhood as the rightful caretaker of life. As a wrap-up to this groundation, we are mindful the culture is not static. It is mobile, ever-changing, and mutating, morphing itself into multiple cultural adaptation through time and space. When millions of Africans were compelled into plantation enslavement, the only tool they had to withstand constant dehumanization was culture. They created new cultural media by juxtaposing Christian symbols onto their traditional cosmogony. They negotiated new ways of grounding their authentic selves, planting new roots thousands of miles away from the imposed routes they were forced to take. And while engaging in this process of rerouting and regrounding ourselves, no matter how traumatic the routes were along the journey, we must converge towards a new poetic of transcontinental and transatlantic relations as a new way of doing something together. Likewise, it is imperative to revive our connections to what the Martinican writer Edouard Glissant terms as the poetic of relations, new and creative ways of being in tune with our life experiences, a relationship through common project transcending the epidermal linkages of Blackness along the different color spectrum. We, the scholars and researchers, we're getting close to the end. And this is the area where we can collaborate as researchers and scholars. We, the scholars and researchers, have to reimagine ourselves as a diverse yet interdependent community that acknowledges but overpasses what Benedict Anderson has termed imagined communities. Our global Blackness reinforces one certitude that has survived centuries of colonialist tabula rasa of our core cultural heritage, and we're talking about Ubuntu. It's an important term because people of African descent, whether they are conscious of it or not, they carry it in their DNA. The term Ubuntu is derived from the word umonu, a human being. Ubuntu philosophy is first and foremost a way of being in the world. As an auntie of mine told me, umuntu agirwa n'ubuntu abantu bakazana ibintu. Simply translated, a person dignifies herself or himself through honor, solidarity with those in need, social justice, and so forth. The practice of these principles is what builds valuable and viable human relationships. And in turn, these relationships are the ones that bring you things, ibintu, in times of need. Furthermore, customary greetings between people refer to ahantu, a place, a home, as in gira iuva niyuja, gira iyo uva wubahwe. Translated, may you have anchored roots and a worthy destination. May you have a dignified home that brings you respect. Thus, from this blending of people, things, and places, and this is where, as researchers, we can come up with certain new concepts and advance the discussion. We propose a new vision we are calling humanitude, which surpasses simply being human. It promotes the notion that a person who is harmoniously grounded in his/her environment that is ahanu. Humanitude, therefore, has to be in tune with all entities in our ecosystem. And this new vision of humanitude, we conclude, could foster a novel common ground for collective and innovative endeavors centering around the areas of collaboration articulated for this symposium. From an epistemological and pedagogical standpoint, we ought to reinvigorate Walter Rodney's approach to creating meaningful linkages between the theorizing practices in the academic world and the positive outcomes the latter should have in the lives of women, men, and children, and non-human relations in the communities they live in. This tenet was first articulated in The Groundings with My Brothers. To emphasize the point, Carol Boyce Davis reminds us, for one thing, its title, Groundings, captured the rooted exchange of knowledge between the academy and the community without privileging the scholarly intellectual over the organic or community intellectual. What Walter offered was a way of making knowledge serve the liberation of our communities from the oppressive European histories and epistemologies. Groundings, then, offers that ability to make knowledge real and allow it to serve our communities, to return to its base, as it were, to re-territorialize our understandings of the world. Accordingly, priority should be given to The Grounding with Our Sisters by Keisha Khan Perry, published in 2009. We are, and we're concluding now, we are eternally indebted to women for being the cornerstones of our societies from times immemorial to the colonially designated destruction of African-descended family during enslavement in the Americas and during the European colonization of Africa. They kept together whatever family stability was left to them by the enslavement and colonialist exploitative systems. This is not to erase the struggles of enslaved men to fight for and keep their families intact, but it is also to say that a people can rise no higher than the condition of its women. Women should, therefore, be equal partners in all our decision-making process, and we thank you very much.